Prior to this new episode of Horrors in History, we covered the bizarre tale of 3 UFO witnesses allegedly poisoned by a strange aircraft. Typically referred to as the Cash Landrum incident, this 1980 close encounter in southeast Texas demonstrated an extremely unconventional scenario of being exposed to toxic conditions. While the thought of being poisoned by a UFO from interstellar space sounds nightmarish, there are plenty of equally terrifying toxic dangers here on Earth. Many of these are known, natural occurrences, growing pains of the planet, some common, while others not so common. Like violent volcanic eruptions beneath certain bodies of water, releasing lethal amounts of pressurized gases. Called limnic eruptions, these geothermal events are extremely temperamental in nature, requiring just the right conditions to be triggered. Every condition was right at a particular lake in Africa on August 21, 1986. Located in Cameroon, it was known as Lake Nyos. The usual calm blue waters suffered a sudden, violent change as hundreds of nearby villagers slept in their beds. The churning lake released a suffocating cloud of carbon dioxide, 160 feet high, and it was heading straight for the villagers. This was the Lake Nyos Disaster, a true horror in history. Lake Nyos is located in the northwest region of Cameroon. Known to the tourism industry as Africa in miniature, Cameroon is an ecologically diverse country on the continent, containing all biospheres present in Africa. From coastal beaches to dense jungles, arid deserts, and towering mountains, diverse ecosystems are inherent to Cameroon's geography. What is also inherent in Cameroon is its volcanic activity. Boasting its own volcano, named Mount Cameroon, the geothermal machinations boiling and steaming under the region created numerous crater lakes, volcanic calderas that filled with water, creating natural lakes that hide insidious secrets. Lake Nyos is one such crater lake, perched high atop an otherwise inactive volcano within the Oku volcanic plain. Lake Nyos is what is known as a meromictic lake, or a lake in which the layers of its waters do not mix. Most lakes are known as holomictic lakes, lakes that see the layers of their waters mix at least once a year for proper temperature and density control throughout each layer. In the case of meromictic lakes, such as Nyos, the bottom layers of the water are extremely dense and cold, with heavy sediment accumulation from stagnation. When volcanic activity is present in these lakes, a buildup of dissolved gases can occur. As time passes and more gas accumulates, conditions continue to destabilize until a limnic eruption is all but inevitable. The gases release valve on a hairpin trigger. Earthquakes, landslides, rises in temperature from volcanic activity, even common storms bringing wind or rain to the lake can trigger a limnic eruption. In Lake Nyos' case, a massive buildup of carbon dioxide saturated the lower layers of the water, dissolved into a solution, not unlike a sealed bottle or can of soda. Like carbonated soft drinks, with their own saturations of carbon dioxide, the soda remains flat until the pressure is released by cracking open a can or twisting open a bottle. Consequentially, Nyos was in desperate need of a proper degassing, and it was about to be cracked wide open. The surrounding villages of the lake, Nyos, Kam, Cha, and Saboom, were all settled by agrarian families, who raised livestock and relied on subsistence farming for food and income. It was around 9 in the evening, many of the villagers already in bed, ready to turn in before an early rise to tend to their crops and animals the following morning. Other villagers, still awake, either relaxed around a fire or tended to unfinished work in their fields and livestock enclosures. The insects murmured and hummed the evening away until a new, ominous sound broke through the usual lunar insectoid choir. A low rumbling suddenly emanated from Lake Nyos. Perhaps one of the first in the area to become aware of the impending doom that was about to take place was Ephraim Shea, a farmer with a mud house on the cliffs overlooking Lake Nyos. Shea would later state that he heard the rumbling, attributing it to what sounded like a possible rock slide. He stepped outside and looked towards the lake, observing an odd mist rising from its waters. Expecting rain, and now feeling a bit unwell, Shay urged his 4 children to bed before he in turn settled in for the night, deciding whatever was happening outside could wait until the morning for more investigation. Further down the cliffs near the lake shore, a cowherd by the name of Halima also recalled hearing the rumbling, though instead of attributing it to a rock slide like Shay, Halima remembered hearing what sounded like the shout of many voices at once. She then observed a strong wind blowing through her village. Halima fell unconscious. The following morning, Ephraim Shay awoke and decided to venture out to discover the cause of the noise he had heard the night before. He first came to a striking image. The once deep blue placid waters of Lake Nyos had turned a ruddy rust color. Debris and foliage from the shores littered across the surface of the water. Shay then realized something major had happened to the lake. He ventured down towards its shoreline, and there he crossed paths with Halima. She was stricken with horror and grief, crying out to Shay, asking him what had happened and why none of her family or animals would wake. Shay almost couldn't bear to look. Surrounding Halima were all 31 members of her family, dead, along with all 400 head of her cattle. Terrified, Shay left for the village Nyos. In the larger village of Nyos, further down in the valley, Shay was met with an even worse sight. Virtually all 1,000 residents of the village were dead, along with their livestock. Amongst the dead were Shay's own parents, siblings, aunts, and uncles. At the time, he believed the world was ending, as he broke down in tears over the bodies of his family, his soft cries being the only sound to be heard, as the typical morning cacophony of local wildlife and insects was silent. Every living creature was dead. Elsewhere, a man traveling from the Cameroon village of Woom was on his way to Nyos, traversing a dirt path by bicycle. He noticed the unusual quiet of the day before coming across a dead antelope, recently deceased. After checking the animal over and finding no signs of spoilage, he packed it onto his bike and continued on, noticing dead animals everywhere he looked. He hurried on to Nyos with intentions of asking the residents about the animals. All he found in Nyos were more corpses. Panicked, he fled, returning to his home in Woom. Once there, he witnessed what few survivors there were of the Lake Nyos disaster as they staggered in for help. In various states of shock, many of the survivors were so weak they could barely stand, barely speak. These survivors lost consciousness the night of the lake's eruption and awoke, up to 2 days later, to a living nightmare, finding themselves alive amongst dead family members. Some who arose to such sights could not bear the grief and were found dead, having committed suicide. For those who escaped and made their way to nearby villages for help, psychological trauma wasn't the only damage the eruption caused them. The survivors were also covered in bloody pressure sores, abscesses on the skin over bony protrusions, typically caused by prolonged bed rest. But because carbon dioxide is around 1.5 times heavier than air, the CO2 cloud released by Lake Nyos was able to break down tissue over pressure points on the victim's skin almost overnight. In addition to the sores, survivors also succumbed to respiratory distress and even paralysis. The deadly CO2 cloud would reach as far away as 12 miles from the epicenter of the eruption, where even more bodies of villagers and animals were discovered. In all, nearly 1,800 people and 3,500 livestock were asphyxiated to death by the invisible gas, most having no idea they were in peril before losing consciousness, left helpless as the oxygen was ripped from their bodies. With thousands of people and livestock dead, news of the tragedy spread fast through the scientific community, and within days, researchers from America and France arrived in Cameroon to investigate. The investigators would note the eerie silence in the affected villages, and the complete lack of flies despite the number of bodies. The flies, too, were dead. Initially, thoughts turned towards a new epidemic of disease. However, with none of the researchers becoming ill, and the survivors showing no signs of infection, focus turned towards the volcanic lake. Suspicion of the lake grew as the researchers approached, the number of bodies rising the closer they got. Arriving at the lake shore, scientists noticed the scourged vegetation, having been thrashed by an apparent tsunami. While no definitive cause of the sudden displacement of CO2 in the lake could be determined, a few leading theories have been presented. One suggests the cause to have been a landslide that fell into the lake from the surrounding cliffs. Others have suggested a minor volcanic eruption on the lake bed, which forced the CO2 to surface. Upon testing the lake's water, researchers discovered and confirmed the released CO2, which dispersed into the surrounding region, leading to the mass casualties. While natural concentrations of airborne CO2 rarely reach above 0.1%, estimates would later show that concentrations of CO2 may have reached a staggering 10% in the Lake Nyos region following the eruption. The U.S. Occupational Safety and Health Administration, commonly known as OSHA, states that negative side effects of high CO2 levels don't occur until around 2% concentration, or 20,000 parts per million, where mild respiratory symptoms may be felt in some people. It isn't until air concentrations reach 40,000 parts per million that health officials warn of potentially dire consequences, including death. If the estimates following the Lake Nyos disaster are correct, air concentrations of CO2 in the region following the eruption may have reached as high as 100,000 parts per million. The thought of anyone surviving such conditions is nothing short of miraculous. In fact, only 4 villagers survived out of the nearly 1,000 residents of Nyos. Theories have suggested environmental conditions could have played a part in keeping the survivors alive. Poorly ventilated homes may have allowed only some of the CO2 to enter the dwelling, sparing those inside. Other residents may have been at a higher elevation than others in their home, perhaps on a raised bed or loft area, where large amounts of CO2 could not reach, whereas others may have benefited from ample ventilation, quickly dispersing the CO2 before concentration levels could become lethal. It would be days before any wildlife would return to the Lake Nyos region, and because of the mirror-mictic nature of Nyos, the investigating researchers knew that it would only be a matter of time before another deadly eruption would occur, as the CO2 levels would resaturate the water. They knew mitigating steps needed to be taken to prevent another tragedy. Being that limnic eruptions are caused by a sudden release of large concentrations of gas, it was decided to install a siphoning system in the lake that would release accumulating gas at a slow yet steady rate, preventing another eruption. It wasn't until as recent as 2019 that the mitigation strategy was concluded as a success, finding that just one siphoning pump could sustain the slow degassing process of the lake without requiring any external power. Lake Nyos has since been declared as safe. While the looming threat of Lake Nyos has come to an end since the devastating disaster in 1986, the fact remains that Lake Nyos is just one of many mirror-mictic lakes, every one a time bomb, ticking away until one day it explodes. One such dormant beast is another lake located in Africa. Boasting such accolades as being included in Africa's Great Lakes, Lake Kivu measures 26 miles long and 31 miles at its widest point. Resting above an immense magma chamber, the difference between Lake Nyos and Lake Kivu is that in addition to dissolved CO2, Lake Kivu also contains vast amounts of dissolved methane, which is a highly combustible gas. It has been suggested that should Lake Kivu suffer a limnic eruption like Nyos underwent in 1986, then all 2 million inhabitants residing around Kivu's shores would find their lives at risk, posing a catastrophic disaster that would dwarf that of the Lake Nyos eruption. For now, Lake Kivu remains stable, even hosting methane drilling platforms which are used to extract the flammable gas for energy production. So for the time being, scientists keep a watchful eye on the lake's conditions, hoping to avert another devastating catastrophe which took so many innocent lives without warning, like the Lake Nyos disaster, making it a true horror in history. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like, share, and subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more videos like this one. Thanks for watching Horrors in History.